All righty. Well, everyone, welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. It's our 100th episode, and the guest I have for this 100th episode is a returning champion, David Swanson, co-founder of World Beyond War, radio show host of Talk Nation Radio, which people can find on SoundCloud, YouTube, and if you have Pacifica Radio, I believe WBAI, you can follow David's work there. Also, of course, you can check out all of David's work at davidswanson.com. And David's our guest. David, thank you for coming back on the program.
Good to be here, Youri.
It's an honor to have you. And just before I get to the first question, I also have to say thank you to you, Greg Azaro, Rachel Small, and the entire World Beyond War team for a superb online event, which I co-hosted with you on the need to end the Western Gulf War on Syria, and I know one of the reasons why I really like your organization is you guys are consistently anti-war, anti-imperialist, not selectively anti-war, anti-imperialist, and to have co-host and to have even agreed to have co-hosted that event with the guests we had, Rick Sterling, Johnny Atchie, and the brilliant Alfred Desaias. I mean, it was wonderful, and my respect for you and the organization went up. So thank you. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. I'm not 100% sure the whole event lived up to the wonderful description there, as at least one of those guests, despite much superb wisdom, was praising one side of the war in Syria. And this is the problem with World Beyond War. We oppose all sides of all wars. And with Syria in particular, it's very hard to find anyone who's opposed to the killing by both sides in that war. It's always, I condemn this side or I condemn that side, never both. And so to have a World Beyond War event with somebody praising his beloved Syrian army and its glorious operations, we're straying a little bit from our ideal message, but it was a very good event with a lot of good exchange of ideas. And
actually, the fact that you mentioned that's a perfect segue to actually the questions I'm about to ask when it comes to war, and how do we when there is a coming war on China or a coming war on Russia or a new insincere, colorful revolution or co-opted revolution that's about to happen, how do we, even if we may not like the Chinese government, even if we may not like Putin, even if we may not like Alexander Lukashenko, how do we convince people not to support the whole R2P BS and the whole liberal interventionism or socialist revolution and all that stuff? So the first question I wanted to ask you then is this: can you push back against the notion of a good war and explain how the Afghanistan war, both in the 1970s, 80s, the Western-backed anti-communist jihadis was not a good war, and how the U.S. NATO-led war on Afghanistan after 9/11 wasn't a good war, that people, especially left-leaning people and feminists and secularists, should not have supported?
Well, the notion of a good war, which goes beyond the idea of a necessary war, a necessary evil, which is itself indefensible, is just absurd. We're talking about organized mass killing and destruction and environmental damage and just tearing up the rule of law and the possibility of self-governance and peace and prosperity. It's the worst thing that humanity has come up with to do to itself is war. So the idea that one of them can be good is just disgusting. The idea that one of them can be necessary is contrary to all available evidence. Every war, contrary to this nonsensical, incoherent notion of last resort, because what would it mean to actually run out of resorts? It's never happened. It is carefully maneuvered into. Peace is carefully avoided, and there was absolutely no need for the United States ever to have anything to do with Afghanistan, good, bad, or otherwise, and to be claiming credit and bragging about having helped destabilize the place and provoke the Soviet Union into a horrible war on Afghanistan does not excuse the horrible crimes of the Soviet Union, does not excuse the horrible crimes of Afghanistan. Blame is not some sticker that gets stuck on one person and nobody else can have any of it. There's infinite blame to go around. But for the United States to claim credit for that as if it were a good accomplishment, with the outcome including having supported the very same groups and people who would later be attacking the United States around the world, including so famously on September 11th, 2001, and having established this policy of going into nations across that entire region and backing religious extremists and murderous sects as preferable to democratic secular tendencies that might lean a little bit too far to the left for corporate interests. This was a disastrous outcome. And then to have abandoned the place after having helped destroy it and left it in the hands of warlords who continued the destruction to their great shame, and then to have gone back in just about exactly 20 years ago yesterday as we're speaking, and carefully maneuvered into that, right? With the newspapers now telling you absolutely falsely that the United States wanted to prosecute crimes and put Osama bin Laden on trial, and the Taliban insisted on having a war, whereas the very same newspapers and all the Western broadcast television outlets and everybody was telling you the exact opposite, which was true back then, 20 years ago, 20 years and a week ago. The Taliban wanted to turn bin Laden over to another country to be put on trial. George W. Bush wanted war, and you can't give up an excuse for war when what you want is a war. And then to have killed almost certainly more than 1 million people, to have destroyed the natural environment. I mean, birds haven't even gone through Afghanistan for years. I mean, the place is poisoned. The forests are leveled. The soil is contaminated. The water is ruined. To have destroyed this place for 20 years and to have routinely blown up men, women, and children with missiles in exactly the same way that stumbled into a news story just as the war was, at least the ground war was ending, because they blew up a family in the middle of Kabul, the capital city, during the biggest news story everywhere for a week of the ending of the so-called longest US war, which we all know is not the longest U.S. war if Native Americans are human beings. Then
exactly, actually funny. Cindy Sheehan, when I asked her about Afghanistan and why anti-imperialists should be opposed to Afghanistan and not fall for the whole good war ideology, she was saying to me, well, Youri, actually, I have to correct you. Afghanistan's not our longest war. Our longest war is the persecution and ongoing subjugation of Native Americans. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that.
I'm delighted to know there are now at least 3 of us in the world who see it that way. I know a couple others. But just to have done this for 20 years, nonstop destruction, and then to proclaim it a good war in the way that World War II is sometimes proclaimed a good war, and never to go back and ask, where did it get that name? When did it get that name? It didn't get it 20 years ago. It didn't get it 20 years ago plus a week in. It got it when Barack Obama was running for president, and it was your moral responsibility to declare Iraq the bad war, but to avoid looking like some sort of nutcase who opposes the idea of war. And therefore, because Iraq was a bad war, you were obliged to declare Afghanistan a good war. And we had peace activists, the very best peace activists, the very most informed and knowledgeable and strategic and courageous peace activists, telling people that the United Nations had authorized the war on Afghanistan because it hadn't authorized the war on Iraq. Therefore, it had, never mind the facts, and everything that was bad about Iraq was supposedly good about Afghanistan. All of the killing of civilians, the torture, the death squads, everything that was being done wrong in Iraq was therefore, by definition, being done right in Afghanistan, even though it wasn't true in any case.
And of course, the argument is that Iraq ghastly dictatorship, but at least it was a secular dictatorship, whereas Afghanistan, they were the backward Muslim country which did attack the United States on September 11th. Ergo, the United States and its allies have the right to attack bin Laden and the Taliban in Afghanistan. I think that's kind of how the war was sort of sold, and how people kind of rationalize Afghanistan good war, but Iraq bad war, right?
Yeah. And it's the partisan shift that allows some of that, because you have a Republican president who agrees to a war on Afghanistan because Tony Blair won't bring the UK into a war on Iraq unless they start a war in Afghanistan first. So it's sort of a gateway war. And then you shift to a warmonger president from the other party, and for him, Iraq was the mistake. They lied about Iraq. That wasn't the country, as you say, responsible for the terrorism. Afghanistan was the right war. We got to get back to Afghanistan. So Obama comes in and actually more than triples the troop deployment, and just several fold multiplies the bombing strikes in Afghanistan, because he doesn't want to be a guy who opposes all war, and he's opposing the war on Iraq, kind of, sort of. So he has to support the war in Afghanistan, which, if you go back and ask, well, how the hell did World War II become a good war? It became a good war during the war on Vietnam, when if you're going to oppose the war on Vietnam, but not be some sort of nutcase who's against all wars, then you have to go back and find some war that was a good war and say, well, I'm against the war on Vietnam. It's mishandled, it's mismanaged, but World War II, that was my favorite kind of war. So, there aren't any wars that are actually, there aren't any wars that if they were the only war in the history of the world, anybody would have called them good in any way, shape, or form. Not a one. They would, if there was only that one war, it would be thought of as the worst thing that ever happened.
And one quick follow-up on Afghanistan is, what are the important lessons everyone, especially those who want to be involved in the peace movement, need to learn from Afghanistan? Because there are some who continue to recycle the whole white man's or white person's burden syndrome. And there's this annoying Western do-goodism of wanting to remain in Afghanistan to eradicate the socially conservative, backward misogynists known as the Taliban.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are endless lessons. We can go on for hours, and you can just tell me when to stop. But one lesson is not to believe the propaganda, not to believe that bombing women is good for the rights of women, and not to believe that Afghanistan became a significantly better place to be a woman or a child or an infant or a human being of any flavor or shape before the mishandled ending of the war or the ending of the war. Afghanistan was, I think, the third worst place on earth for childbirth prior to the evil takeover of the Taliban. Right? Yeah. Not to believe that human rights or legality had anything to do with it. This was a war that revived out of virtual elimination the poppy growth and the drug trade, and created a drug epidemic within the United States as well as other places. This was a war that just demolished the rule of law, created the acceptance of military invasions, generated new excuses for them, that eroded the idea of prosecuting war as a crime. The International Criminal Court has bowed to US pressure and ceased all investigation of even particular atrocity crimes committed by the US in Afghanistan. It normalized torture, a war that normalized torture for brutal dictatorships across the globe. 20 years of dramatic escalation in the armaments of militaries, with the United States now arming and training and funding most of the oppressive governments around the world. A war that over 20 years generated all sorts of new hatreds and bigotry, and the safety and the security and the inclusion of Muslim Americans in the United States has plummeted. A war that militarized domestic police forces across the globe and across the United States. So we have to learn that wars have all kinds of endless consequences that are going to continue for decades. And the United States has spent $21 trillion on militarism over 20 years. There's over $1 trillion a year. Just dumped another $750 billion into the Pentagon, and then there's an extra $500 billion in other agencies and care of veterans and debt on past wars. And you have the top news story in the United States being this pair of bills, these two pieces of legislation that are supposedly the biggest, most expensive things in the history of the earth. And combined, they're dramatically less than the military spending bill that just passed, that just increased military spending despite the ending of the war. So a war, the messaging of which normalized ever increasing war spending, even to such an extent that the war could even end, and that goes on untouched. I think one important lesson is to question all the absurdity of talking about the war being lost, the war not being won, the war being mismanaged, when for the entire 20 years, nobody was ever required to give a definition of what winning would look like, what the point was, what the goal was. You don't win these things. You go into somebody else's country and bomb people and kick in doors and shoot people up. The top reason people had for supporting the Taliban was the US NATO occupation, right? It was their brutality. And the top funding sources of the Taliban year after year after year were, the two close competitors for number one funding source of the Taliban were the US military and the drug trade. So this was a corrupt disaster, and it didn't even do what it was supposedly intended to do, and that was to go after terrorism and stop terrorism. And the believers in the humanitarian excuses for the war can't even explain their initial support for it, because the humanitarian excuses mostly came years later. But they also can't explain the much bigger chunk of the US population that supported the war out of vicious hatred and revenge. They can't explain the official statements of the US president and the US Congress that the motivation was revenge, which isn't moral or legal or practical or, and so for years, this war on terrorism increased terrorism. And took a terrorist group hiding in a few caves in one country and generated terrorist groups across the capitals of North Africa and Central Asia. And this is called a war against terrorism, a war on terrorism. And the countries that took part as sidekicks, as ridiculously small junior partners, clearly there to somehow give some pseudo-legitimacy to the war, generated terrorism back home in their own countries in proportion to how many troops they sent to help out in Afghanistan. So the countries that sent more troops, to still tiny numbers, to help out the US dominated occupation of and war on Afghanistan, generated more terrorism than the countries that sent less, and it's proportional and predictable. So here's a lesson. Don't join in a war on China. Don't join in a war on Russia. It doesn't benefit you. It doesn't, these are your top trading partners you're fighting a war against, and you're going to generate terrorism.
And then two quick things before I ask you about the Gulf War is you can make the argument, and I think you can win the argument, that regardless of whatever one feels about communism and stuff like that, you can make the argument that if we had just let the Communist Party of Afghanistan and their Soviet backers educate, completely eradicate patriarchy and so forth like that, and yes, some of the ways they went about it was pretty brutal towards the reactionary Islamists. But in the end of the day, we supported we supported Bin Laden and so forth, who later came to smash down the World Trade Center, and even the people who we supported in the invasion to oust the Taliban all committed systemic human rights abuses. From rapes to torture to the trafficking of kids and stuff like that, right?
Absolutely. If you were to erase from history the US and British and Western antagonism toward the Soviet Union, which existed from the day the Soviet Union existed, history would be so dramatically different. We wouldn't even be talking about the approach to Afghanistan in the 1970s. You wouldn't have the Western support for the rise of Nazism in Germany in the 1930s. Yep. You would either not have World War II, or you would have it very differently. You certainly wouldn't have the Cold War that began the day World War II ended. And so even if you were to imagine a similar world to the one that actually existed in the 1950s, but rid of hostility toward communism in the United States, well, then you would have a recognition that the communist countries, for all the good and all the ill in them, did not actually have a conspiracy to militarily take over the globe. And you would have disarmament, and you could have an end of major warfare. And if you had that, well, then you would have the good and the ill in the communist countries and in the non-communist countries exposed and judged on its merits. And you would see how much of the ill in the communist countries was actually a response to the hostility from the Western countries, and how much was, more inherent, inevitable flaws in their governments. But this is not the world we've had. We've had a world where first communism, and then Middle Eastern Islamic terrorism, and now the horrible threat of the anti-democratic autocracies led by Russia and China. And maybe we have to put the Philippines in there now with the Nobel Peace Prize announcement, targeting Russia and the Philippines rather than rewarding any peace activists anywhere. This is the justification that's used for massive military spending, for the number one thing the US government does. And it can't be done without an enemy. It can't be done without an excuse. And the people who thought they really meant that communism, that the Soviet Union was the problem, were shocked, right? In 1989, when there was no peace dividend, there was no scaling back, there was no closing of bases, that the militarism continued, the wars continued. And if people come to see how small and unthreatening Islamic terrorism is and how much of it is generated by US military occupations, and they lose belief in that excuse for wars, they may notice rather quickly that the wars go on regardless. So the military spending goes on regardless. These are excuses, not actual motivations.
Perfect segue to the first Gulf War in the 80s and early 90s, led by Daddy Bush. That's often described and endorsed by many left-leaning people as a good war, unlike the second Iraq War led by Bush Jr. Now, can you push back against the argument that the first Gulf War was a good war because the world came to the rescue of poor autocratic monarch Kuwait and put Saddam Hussein, the aggressor, in his place?
Yeah, again, there's a problem with the idea of something that didn't have to happen, that involves mass slaughter, murder of human beings, and endless destruction of living things and the natural environment, as being good. There are better wars. There is no question that there are better wars and worse wars. And the better wars tend to be the ones that somebody ended more quickly. If the Gulf War had never ended and was still going on, nobody would be talking about it as a good war. They'd be talking about it as an endless war. But because they stopped it, and of course they stopped it in a way that made things worse for many people, including parties that they had made commitments to that were then abandoned and slaughtered, prior to which most of the killing had, illegally, even under the laws of war, been of troops that were retreating. But this, the idea that there was something good about it because it accomplished something rather quickly, got Iraq out of Kuwait, and then somebody had the sense to end it rather than just continue it forever. Well, that makes it better than some of the more recent wars. Even the war on Libya, which nobody mentions as a good war because it's so blatantly horrible, is a better war than some of these other wars because somebody had the sense to stop it, or at least stop Western participation in it. But the idea that it's a good war, that it wouldn't have been better to do without that war. Again, if the first Gulf War were the only war that had ever happened in the history of the world, people would look at it as the stupidest, most horrible, brutal, murderous, criminal thing that had ever happened. It's just in comparison to other wars. So
also, sorry to interrupt, but the big lie of why we, because Europe was part of it. Europe, as always, was a partner in crime to it. Australia, New Zealand, Canada. The slaughter that took place in the first Gulf War was Iraq was taking babies out of incubators when they invaded Kuwait, and of course that was a whole bunch of BS. And the person who made that testimony was a professional liar paid by other professional liars, and was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador. But anywho, but the reason we're going into Iraq to defeat another Hitler because he's taking Kuwaiti babies out of incubators. That was a lie.
Right. Well, this was a young woman who was the daughter of the ambassador to the U.S., who was coached and trained by a public relations company in Washington, D.C., how to testify. And well, just helping a young person do a good job. No, because it was blatant lies. It was a fabricated story. They were coaching her how to tell a fictional tale that was to motivate a war. And of course, if somebody takes babies out of incubators, you don't actually help more babies by bombing the hospital. You help them by enforcing the rule of law and establishing through diplomatic pressure that it's not acceptable to take babies out of incubators. I mean, this is the problem, is what do people understand as acceptable? The Iraqi government understood the United States to not care if it attacked Kuwait. And it seems quite probable that the US government wanted the Iraqi government to understand that and to attack Kuwait. And as soon as that happened, the US government changed its tune and said, this is a justification for a war. And you had presidents across the globe, you had the Pope, you had all these big figures saying, let's negotiate a peace. And you had Iraq saying, okay, let's negotiate a peace. And you had the US government. So are you going to go and ruin a good excuse for a war? We're busy coaching this girl how to talk about babies and incubators, and you want to take away our excuse for a war? Forget it. We're having the war. So this is the problem. When people fall for this sort of thing, they think, well, there was no way. How could you stand by and allow the rule-based order to be violated, right? I mean, and yet the United States stands by for worse crimes and participates in worse crimes routinely. This was an excuse that it latched onto because it wanted a war.
And we won't get into all of the other epic crimes against humanity that was inflicted on Iraq after the Gulf War, like the sanctions of mass destruction, followed by the Second Iraq War. I think everyone knows very well that Iraq. If there was a country that said, all of you guys, reparations, I think Iraq would definitely be top on that list of of top 5 or top 10 countries. So then talk to us then about Yugoslavia, because that's depicted, the NATO bombing of Kosovo and Serbia. That's depicted as a good war. Slobodan Milosevic was a genocidal Serbian brute, and he was the last of communistic brutes that we had to deal with. So talk to people, because I live in Europe, and many of these many left-leaning people, supposedly left-leaning people in Greens, have a complete blind spot when it comes to NATO and stuff like that. So can you push back against how Yugoslavia and Western European interventionism and American interventionism in Yugoslavia, push back against Yugoslavia being the good war?
Yeah, I mean, there are at least a couple of major problems here, right? One is the war itself. One is that even if you fantasize that this was Robin Hood coming in to save the day from the evil forces and set people free, Robin Hood has never left. World Beyond War just gave our War Abolisher of the Year award 2 days ago to the Save Sinyevina movement in Montenegro, where shepherds up in the fields in the mountains have built a camp and put their bodies on the line to prevent the construction of a new NATO military base, weapons training ground in these beautiful mountains in Montenegro, where Montenegro had the misfortune, to recently become a member of NATO. The NATO troops in general have never left Yugoslavia and have been moving in greater numbers to each of the new little bits of Yugoslavia, like Montenegro. And this was the goal from the start, was to demonstrate the need for NATO and militaries and weapons, despite the collapse of the Soviet Union that we mentioned a minute ago, and to get NATO into more countries and more countries into NATO and more troops and more bases. And so you have the former Yugoslavia chopped up into little pieces of corrupt governments subservient to NATO, with more and more military bases all the time.
All of them competing oligarchs, all of them competing mobsters, all of them competing far right, reactionary, crooks.
Right, and there was no need. There was ample time to attempt numerous approaches to address the violence rather than escalate it. And yes, there were horrible deeds committed by all sides, but the propaganda is always exaggerated about one side and not the others. And the horrible deeds of NATO, bombing civilians, bombing hospitals, bombing media outlets, bombing embassies, bombing areas where people were being killed. But then the massacres escalate.
Uranium as well.
Using depleted uranium, poisoning the ground forever, essentially, and the propaganda afterwards being twisted such that we're told that horrible massacres happened first, and then NATO dropped bombs, and then there was peace and harmony, whereas in fact the massacres escalated and mainly took place after the bombings, and the events have been put into reverse order so that people understand a different lesson from what actually happened. This was a big deal for NATO because it helped establish that NATO had some reason to exist with the Warsaw Pact gone, and it helped Congress establish that the United States could wage wars without the United Nations, tricking the US public into thinking that a war is legitimate if a whole bunch of countries take part and some institution like NATO takes part, whereas usually getting a big gang to join in a crime doesn't make it legal, it's still a crime. And in establishing that a war could be thus waged without Congress having to deal with any of the atrocities or the outrages or the particular war crimes, as they call them, within the war, because they're NATO's problem, not Congress's. And so this was a model for what's happened, in the 30 years since.
So, and one of these days, I definitely want to have you back on the program to have hopefully a rational debate about Yugoslavia and stuff like that, because I have a friend who believes in Kosovo nationhood and believes that Yugoslavia is the good war, even though she's against most other wars. So we'll definitely return to that subject in another episode. But thank you for demystifying and debunking the lies about Yugoslavia being the good war, and that's a perfect segue then to Ukraine. Explain how the EU, Euromaiden, NATO-backed color revolution / coup in Ukraine and the ongoing efforts to support the Western-backed oligarchs and neo-Nazis in Ukraine, and the ouster of the previous center-right government, which led to a still brutal ongoing war in Ukraine, as well as Crimea deciding to divorce Ukraine to be part of Russia. Explain how, once again, this Western-backed civil war in Ukraine is not a good war.
Well, I don't know how many ways I can explain to people that there's no such thing as a good war, but great minds think alike. I was going to bring up Ukraine just a minute ago because I think the contrast is so great between those who believe that the people of Kosovo have the right to leave a country, to start a new country, to join a different country. That's their right. If they, and I agree, I think people anywhere should have the right to secede, to shift, to join a different country, start a new country, whatever they like. But the people who believe that about Kosovo, there's essentially zero overlap with the people who believe that about Crimea. In Crimea, the people who think they should have the right to decide what country they're a part of. Well, this is the major threat to the rule of law, the established order, the peace and prosperity of the globe that we've all enjoyed for all of these past many decades, all of the harmony and tranquility that has blessed Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and Pakistan and Somalia, the general lack of warfare and violence in the world that we all know and love. This is what U.S. professors will tell you at universities across the United States. all of that, beautiful imaginary peace and tranquility was violated and threatened with eternal destruction by the horror of the takeover of Crimea, in which rumor has it somebody chipped a fingernail, right? But otherwise the casualties were pretty non-existent. And not a single person ever have I discovered who had any objection to what happened in Crimea has proposed that the people there vote again, because they know perfectly well how they would vote. And the idea that that Russian military intimidation determined the vote is not believed by any of the most hysterical critics of anything that's happened in Crimea. And so either you believe that people in Czechoslovakia have the right to decide to split into two countries, and people in Kosovo and people in South Sudan and people around the world have this right unless they're in Crimea, or you believe people don't have this right. But to suggest that this, rather than the war on Iraq or the creation of war by robot airplanes or any of the horrors or the massive escalation in armament of brutal governments around the globe, that these aren't the problem, that the proliferation of nuclear weapons and the escalated construction and deployment of nuclear weapons and the increasing rhetoric about using nuclear weapons, that this is not a problem, that the problem is how the people in Crimea voted to rejoin Russia, that's the problem. I mean, this is just nuts, but this is mainstream, respectable US thought. And if you suggest otherwise, you're crazy. And you have the US government and the Canadian government and the NATO governments training on the ground, in person, training neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine, right?
Yeah.
And arming and funding. And, quite a number of us, for a long list of reasons, starting with domestic and going into international reasons, pushed for Donald Trump to be impeached and removed from office, starting on the day he was inaugurated, right? And the Democratic Congress wanted nothing to do with it year after year after year. And then somebody interfered with weapons shipments to Ukraine, slowed down some weapons shipments to Ukraine. And then, boy, time for an impeachment. And never mind the weapons shipments, never mind the corruption from Joe Biden and his gang and the Ukrainian government.
Exactly.
Never mind the Trump-like sitcom star clown who was put in charge of Ukraine by people desperate enough to want anybody who wasn't a politician, who was supposed to be neutral and peacemaking, and immediately bowed before NATO. Never mind the coup that was facilitated by the US government quite openly, that preceded the vote in Crimea, that followed the establishment of a new government that immediately began banning the Russian language and threatening to limit the rights of essentially Russian people who make up the eastern half of Ukraine. So none of this exists in US consciousness, right? The dozens of coup attempts and successful coups in recent years, or for that matter, the hundreds of them going back over the decades, they don't exist in the US mind. People aren't told. So what happens in Ukraine is what Russia does, or what Russia does to Crimea, and it doesn't make any sense. But then a bunch of Saudis who you blame on Afghanistan blowing up buildings in the United States simply because they hate your freedoms and haven't noticed 36 other countries that have more freedoms than you do, doesn't make any sense either. It doesn't have to make sense, apparently.
It's unbelievable, but it goes to show you the power of propaganda and how so many people just have these imperial blind spots and don't think to dig deeper into even official history when it comes to, lionizing these people in Ukraine who lionize Nazi collaborators and so forth. And And that's a perfect segue to the new Cold War on China. And I want you to, can you, explain, why is it that, once upon a time, even if people were against communism, they would protest against the Vietnam War. Why there was mass people on the streets saying no war for oil in the second Iraq War, although there were some who said no war for oil when the first Gulf War happened. Why, when it came to Libya, there was no mass mobilization saying no war for oil? Why Venezuela, when it's under attack, when Bolivia is under attack, there are no mass demonstrations of people saying no war for oil and mining? And why is it that again, once upon a time, you had people who acknowledged that Saddam Hussein was was a brutal dictator, some even a Western-backed brutal dictator, but that doesn't mean that we invade a country on bogus, trumped-up charges of WMDs because we know that it's an imperial war. Why is it that's rational, that line of thinking doesn't exist for Syria or even China, which is which is an Asian communist system? There is no mass demonstrations against the pivot to Asia, and again, you have people who are backing reactionary forces in Hong Kong, reactionary forces in Xinjiang, because much of the Uyghur rights, Uyghur separatist movements are wolves in sheep's clothing. These are people who want to install a caliphate. So yeah, so basically, to sum up my question, why is it that we don't why is it that people are selectively anti-war and not consistently anti-war when we know the powers to be lie about every war and of course both you and I are of the opinion that war is the ultimate crime. There's no such, forget war crimes, war itself is a crime.
Absolutely. I think it's only rivaled by the destruction of ecosystems and climate. Otherwise, nothing comes close. And I think that includes poverty and deprivation, all of which could be easily alleviated by moving money out of war. I think people are selectively anti-war because, as we've discussed, they are all trained and conditioned to believe that some wars are good and some wars are bad, and to oppose all wars is just nuts. And so the argument that we make at World Beyond War, that people can read at worldbeyondwar.org, that all war and the institution of war, even more so than all the particular wars put together, is indefensible, is just outside the radar of the corporate media and the mainstream discourse. And knowledge of nonviolent activism as an alternative to war, and the facts, the overwhelming research that nonviolent campaigns, even against tyrants and dictators and invasions and occupations, are more likely to succeed, significantly more likely to succeed than violent ones. Even good leftist, heroic, revolutionary, communist, leftist, violent campaigns are imagined as this thing you resort to when there's no other choice. But you can't resort to something as the ultimate when it's less likely to succeed than numerous other nonviolent activist approaches. And so in this era of follow the facts, believe the science, stop ignoring the experts, we're supposed to be deniers, nonviolent activism deniers. We can't be climate deniers, we can't be medicine deniers, but we can sure as hell be nonviolent activism deniers and proclaim the need for violence. And then insist that it be violence for a good cause, that it be the last resort, even though that doesn't make any sense because there are always all these other resorts, that it be strictly regulated and reformed, and that we not attack hospitals, only houses and so forth. This is what people are told, and then in the United States, at least politically, people don't identify with pro-war or anti-war. They identify with Democratic Party or Republican Party. Even though the majority of people don't like either party, they identify more with one or the other, or they identify more with liberalism and slightly leftist or right-wing conservative, and so you have the war on Iraq made incredibly unpopular by the foolish, year-long marketing campaign that they did to sell it, which is always a dumb idea. When you're going to tell people we got to hurry up and have a war, there's no other choice, you can't then, spend months marketing it on blatant lies that are going to be disproven on, in the first day of the war. We're going to go in there and find all these weapons, and then on, the second day of the war, where are all the weapons? So this was the stupidest propaganda campaign. It wasn't more dishonest. It wasn't more malevolent. It was just stupider. It was more badly done. And then you had Democrats elected to the White House and the Congress, and it wasn't a bad war anymore. And it's so cynical and it's so manipulative.
And do you think, and so do you think that's why people completely fell asleep at the wheel on Libya, which was clearly a war for oil, and you still have people committed to the bitter end to destroy Syria, even though it's so obvious that that ISIS, al-Nusra, the supposed Kurdish nationalist anarchist syndicalists are all backed to the teats by the West and the Gulf, and that Syria is just another evil war. And again, you don't have to like President Assad, but what's going to come after he's overthrown is just another humanitarian catastrophe, as we see with every war. Libya, Afghanistan, Vietnam, and so forth and so forth, right?
Yeah, I think that President Obama didn't launch a year-long marketing campaign for the glory of a war on Libya. He didn't even ask Congress to authorize a war on Libya, as if it's somehow legal if Congress authorizes it. This is a universally held belief in the United States. Congress can't authorize, an individual murder or a rape or a theft, but a war, sure. Never mind that it's actually illegal under international law. And he did it quickly, and he did it without Congress, and he did it with a UN authorization, albeit one that didn't authorize what he did. He did it where there was some UN authorization that had the word Libya in it, had nothing to do with bombing the capital and overthrowing the government, but there was this pretense that somehow it did. So it's UN legal. Don't bother with Congress. Don't bother with the marketing campaign. Don't tell a bunch of stupid lies about how you're about to find these vast stockpiles of weapons that you aren't going to find. So it wasn't done as stupidly. And then, yes, Obama was a Democrat, so the Democrats weren't going to oppose it. The Republicans tend to be slightly more pro-war, so they were less likely to oppose it. And still, it was incredibly unpopular in polls of the US public. There just wasn't time or energy or mobilization of people. There wasn't funding in organizations to turn out masses of people in the streets. And everybody had been conditioned to believe that all their massive turnouts in the streets before the invasion of Iraq had failed, right? So why bother? And of course, everything partially succeeds and partially fails. They did turn many countries against the invasion of Iraq and the UN against the invasion of Iraq and made it something shameful. But then when Obama wanted to carpet bomb Syria in the records made public by the journalist Seymour Hersh in 2013. The public was so against it. And the phone calls and emails into Congress, even if it wasn't a march in the street, outpaced anything ever before then or since, as far as I know. And the British Parliament, in response to public pressure, voted against Britain taking part in a war on Syria for the first time ever, that the British Parliament had said no to a prime minister about a war since the creation of the United States. And so there was public pressure against, and some of it was Republicans, and Obama was a Democrat. Some of it was that sliver of people who actually oppose war, but it was significant. And what changed it was 2014 and videos of white English-speaking people having their throats slit and people in cages, and the inability to think that follows fear. And because of that inability to think that follows fear, you had a willingness, at least an acquiescence in the US public, to go ahead and join the war now, even if some people grasped that it was the opposite side of the war, that they had this moral obligation to join the year before, and they had all said no to it.
So the whole atrocity pornography, atrocity propaganda, like World War I, there was fake news always published that the Germans were crucifying Belgians. Iraq, of course, it was Saddam has WMDs. Libya, it was Gaddafi's giving Viagra to Black African mercenaries to commit mass rapes. And with Syria, well, it was a combination of Assad is committing genocide, and ISIS, which we have nothing to do with, even though ISIS was funded by the Western Gulf, they're chopping off heads. So we have to bomb Syria and kill both Assad and ISIS, even though we are supporting ISIS against Assad.
Yes.
Right.
Well, it was what got the U.S. public to go along to the extent that it did, and they weren't allowed to vote. They've never, passed a Ludlow amendment to allow a public vote. What got them to go along was ISIS, was fear of ISIS. And what got the U.S. government in, of course, was their everlasting quest to overthrow Assad. I'm sorry, Assad must be condemned for his war making. There's nothing inexcusable or legal about it. But overthrowing a government and brutally through mass murder and deadly sanctions, overthrowing a government and failing to do so year after year after year and pretending it's about to succeed, this is horrendous and criminal and predictable. You don't disempower a bad leader by sanctioning and threatening. That rallies people around him or her, right? Predictably, case after case after case. And so that can't be the real motivation. But it sort of was the motivation that everybody in the US government thought they had, was to overthrow Assad. And so you had these comical incidents where a reporter at the US State Department asks the spokesperson, would you rather have ISIS take over this city or have the Syrian government take over this city? And the guy literally can't speak, can't say anything because if he says ISIS, then the US public goes nuts. And if he says, and if he says Assad, well, then he's out of work, right? And so he just couldn't say anything.
Oh, unfortunately, I think we're out of time, aren't we?
I think so. Yeah.
Well then. Okay. Well, okay. If I can squeeze one last question, then, how can we then, those of us who are anti-imperialists, consistently anti-imperialist, anti-war, against all forms of militarism, against all forms of imperialism, how can we convince people who have who are xenophobic, who suffer from anti-China derangement syndrome, just like anti-Russian derangement syndrome? How do we say to them, guys, sit this one out. Do not support the pivot to Asia and Hong Kong separatism, Uyghur separatism, and détente and détente with China, not war with China.
Well, the reasons are endless. We don't have time for them all, but a nuclear war kills everyone, including you, whoever you are. A war is devastating to everyone, wherever they are, even if non-nuclear. And the threat of war and the sanctions and the hostility and the condemnations of abuses and human rights violations, real and fictional, doesn't do anything to alleviate those human rights abuses, doesn't make China a better place in any way, doesn't undo any of the real failings of China. Quite the reverse. Over and over again, dozens of countries over decades, you threaten them, you attack them, you sanction them. It further empowers the government that you are supposedly trying to attack. So ask yourself, if you care about Uyghurs and you're outraged about Uyghurs and you want to help them, how does bombing them help them? Right. And what does bombing other people near them do to help them? And what would it look like if the United States ceased being the top holdout on major human rights treaties and signed and ratified them? What would it look like if the United States stopped being the top enemy of the International Criminal Court and the World Court and supported them? What would it look like if the United States stopped arming and funding and training dozens of the most oppressive governments across the globe, including funding bioweapons labs in China and sharing in funding military efforts with China, their biggest enemy? No matter what you think of bioweapons labs and what they may or may not have done, and I maintain that nobody knows what they may or may not have done, is absolutely nuts. And so, if you're a vicious sadist and you want to bomb Chinese people, even if it ends up killing yourself, that's one thing. But if you want to improve human rights and peace and prosperity around the world, stop trying an approach that has been counterproductive for years and years and years. And we don't have to pretend that China is perfect. We don't have to pretend that China is the worst place on earth. We don't have to agree or know or even gather the facts in detail on what China has or hasn't done. But we do need to stop using that as an excuse to do something worse. And we do need to stop imagining that war is a police action and that war prevents something worse than war, because there isn't anything worse than war.
Yeah, and all wars are BS. All wars are BS, and they are using lots of BS and weaponizing even half-truths for this new Cold War on China and Belarus right now, which they're trying to overthrow Lukashenko to make it into another Yugoslavia, Eastern European puppet NATO regime. But anywho, well, we were joined on this edition of 1+1 with the brilliant David Swanson, who is one of the best people to, one of the best people to not have the Nobel Peace Prize. And and David, thank you so much for joining me. I hope to have you back on the future soon. Hope to do events with World Beyond War in the future, especially when it comes to the wars which many left-leaning folk are endorsing. But until then, best of luck with everything. I hope to hear from you soon, and you have a very great weekend. And thanks for being a guest on the 100th episode.
Thanks. Same to you, Youri.
Ciao till then.